Shomadip, should we start now? Should we wait for a few more minutes?
We will start in 2-3 minutes. This one is absent, one of the presenters. We will wait for 2-3 minutes, or we will go in this order. If he is not present in the meantime, we will skip him.
Yeah.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Undergraduate Symposium of Precision 2021 on Astrophysics and Cosmology. I'm Oishwarya Taravdar, a third-year undergraduate student at Presidency University. Let me inform you about the instructions to be followed. Please turn off your video and audio during the session. A small note to our speaker that the talk will be of 12 minutes and the Q&A session will be conducted over an extended 3 minutes after the talk. You're requested to end your talk within the allotted 12 minutes, and I hope that we can maintain the time during this session. To our audience, if you have any questions, please write them down in the chat box. We shall address all the questions in the Q&A session after the talk is over. This session will be chaired by Moitreyo Kundu. So I request Moitreyo Da to take over the session. Over to you, Moitreyo Da.
Thank you, Oishwarya. So, a very warm welcome to the presenters and the audience. So, this is the Astrophysics and Cosmology session, and there will be 4 talks in this session. I won't repeat the instructions again since Oishwarya already said them clearly. So, the first talk of this session will be given by Zilay Shah from the Indian Institute of Technology, Roorkee. So, Zilay, you can go ahead and start your talk.
Yeah, I'll share my screen. Is it visible?
Yeah, it's visible.
Okay. So I am Zilay Shah, and today I'll talk about my investigation of magnetic fields that I did with Dr. Amit Setha at the Australian National University. So the majority of investigation done till date to identify the magnetic fields of galaxies has been done for spiral galaxies, usually because they are great in numbers, easy to observe, and have substantial magnetic field strengths of a few tenths of microgauss. In this image on the left, I show an optical image of the M51 spiral galaxy. It is evident that these spiral arms that extend outwards are in an orderly fashion. In this image on the right side, the lines represent the strength and the direction of the magnetic fields. It is seen that the magnetic fields are ordered in the direction of the ordered spiral arms. Thus, this magnetic field is the large-scale magnetic field, which is ordered over larger scales. However, due to turbulence presence in the medium of galaxies, there is a small-scale magnetic field that can currently be not resolved with the resolution of the telescopes. The magnetic field generation and amplification mechanisms are explained by the dynamo theory. For instance, in this image, I show a bicycle dynamo. The spinning wheel generates kinetic energy, and this kinetic energy is converted into electrical energy by the virtue of this device. The same mechanisms are at play in the galaxies. So the gas dynamics amplify, create, and shape the galaxies. As we saw in the last slide, spiral galaxies have well-defined rotation and which is a large-scale dynamics. that orders the magnetic fields over large scales. And however, the presence of turbulence is on smaller scales, and thus the small scale magnetic fields also need to be studied. The small scale dynamo, which is driven by turbulence, strongly amplifies these small scale magnetic fields, which cannot be directly observed in spiral galaxies because of the resolution of our telescopes. That is why we go on to investigate magnetic fields in elliptical galaxies. In this image, the comparison between spiral galaxy and elliptical galaxy, it is evident that the elliptical galaxy lacks a well-defined rotation and lacks any large-scale structure. This is because the gas is clumped together and it is driven by the random motions of the gas, which is driven by turbulence. Thus, the turbulent environment of an elliptical galaxy would give rise to the magnetic fields due to the small-scale dynamo. And the absence of lack of well-defined rotation and any large-scale structure would prevent any large-scale dynamo actions from occurring. Thus, if we want to study the small-scale dynamo in details, we have to study the magnetic fields of elliptical galaxies in details. Before I go on to discuss the methods by which we calculate the magnetic fields, I will discuss few concepts about the Faraday rotation measure. When an electromagnetic wave passes through a medium which has an ordered magnetic field, the polarization angle of that magnetic wave rotates. For example, in this image, the initial polarization is along the vertical direction, and when it passes through the magnetic field, the polarization angle is rotated towards the clockwise direction. The quantity rotation measure quantifies this polarization angle rotation, and Rm multiplied with the wavelength square gives the exact value of how much the angle rotates. The rotation measure is dependent upon various properties of the gas, such as the gas density, the magnetic field in the direction parallel to the electromagnetic wave propagation, and the path length through which the electromagnetic wave travels through the intervening gas. However, when there are multiple cells present with random magnetic fields, then multiple Rm values are present inside every cell. So when the electromagnetic wave passes through such a medium, there are multiple Rm fluctuations that the beam of the electromagnetic wave encounters. This not only causes the rotation of magnetic fields, the rotation of polarization angle, but also attenuates the value of polarization and causes depolarization. Thus, the depolarization can give us information about the small-scale magnetic fields, which are caused due to the random fluctuation of the rotation measure. In a radio galaxy, there are two radio lobes. One radio lobe usually points towards the direction of the observer. It is known as the jet side, and the other radio lobe points away from the direction of the observer, known as the counterjet. It can be seen that the radiation from the counterjet has to travel more through the medium of the galaxy to reach the observer as compared to the radiation from the jet. Thus, if in the medium of the galaxy, random fluctuations of rotation measure, or in other terms, small-scale magnetic fields generated by turbulence are present, then the counterjet side would depolarize more as compared to the jet side. For example, in this image taken at two different wavelengths, the lines represent the polarization angle and the magnitudes. When the wavelength is increased, the polarization naturally rotates because of the rotation measure, but the bottom part, which is the counterjet, also undergoes a higher depolarization, as can be seen as the lengths of the polarization values reduce a lot. Thus, differences in the polarization values of jet and counterjet can provide us information about the small-scale magnetic fields present inside the medium of the galaxy. We calculate the small-scale magnetic fields for two different profiles in elliptical galaxies. One is uniform profile and the second one is King profile, which is usually very nicely applicable to elliptical galaxies. The field strength obtained in elliptical galaxies vary from 0.1 to 2.7 microgauss for our sample of radio galaxies. The usual field strength in spiral galaxies is 10 microgauss. Thus, the small-scale magnetic field strength in elliptical galaxies is observed to be an order of magnitude lower than the spiral galaxies. We also investigate the magnetic fields in elliptical galaxies using another method, which is by investigating the background polarized emission from radio sources. So, when a radio source emits radiation, it has certain polarization properties. And there are intervening galaxies in the path when the radiation travels from its source to the observer. So when we investigate the radiation intervening through an elliptical galaxy and a spiral galaxy, different polarization properties are observed for the same radio source. This is because an elliptical galaxy has different gas density, different magnetic fields, and different path lengths than a spiral galaxy. So in this slide, I show an image of all the radio sources and the intervening galaxies that we have obtained from NVSS and STSS datasets. The circles show the locations of the radio sources, and the solid dots represent different types of intervening galaxies. Orange dots represents the spiral galaxies, and green dots represent the elliptical galaxies. So when we study properties of radio sources which only intervene through elliptical galaxies or spiral galaxies and compare the polarization properties between the two, then information regarding the small-scale magnetic fields can be obtained. Here, we plot the polarization values for intervening spiral galaxies and intervening elliptical galaxies. It can be seen that the average polarization value of radio sources with intervening ellipticals is higher than the intervening spirals. This is because spirals depolarize the background radiation more because of a higher thermal electron density and stronger small-scale magnetic fields. Thus, by comparing the magnetic fields and their statistical properties, and using the fact that we know that the magnetic fields in spiral galaxies is approximately a few tens of microgauss, we can predict these magnetic fields in elliptical galaxies. We obtain the magnetic field in elliptical galaxy to be 6 microgauss at the center of ellipticals, which is still smaller than the center of spiral galaxies, which is in a few tens of microgauss. Thus, to conclude, we obtain similar results with two completely different observational methods. And the data sets we use are very recent. Thus, this study gives the magnetic fields with the most recent data sets, and this is the most accurate analysis done to date. These techniques that we use to obtain the magnetic fields can be used to study the magnetic fields in details with the upcoming surveys, which will observe the radio sources and the intervening galaxies in millions and billions of numbers respectively. And the strength of the magnetic fields can be used to constrain the current galaxy evolution simulation models. We are currently extending this work to analyze the magnetic fields in dwarf galaxies, and this work is accepted in MNRS, and it can be found at this link. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hila, for the nice talk. So we already have a few questions in the chat box. So Shomadip Kundu asks, how do RM fluctuations cause depolarization? So if you would like to talk about that.
Yeah, so it is a highly mathematical formula, but so it is defined by the Burns law, which gives the depolarization with RM fluctuations. So for that, Faraday dispersion function has to be defined. And in the absence of any synchrotron emission inside the medium of galaxy, the Faraday dispersion function is simply a Gaussian distribution of the variance of RM values. So using that, the Burns law can be derived, which gives the polarization decrease as a function of the variance of the RM values and the wavelength.
Okay, thanks a lot. So there is another question from Saurav Natto, which is not exactly related to this talk, but if you'd like to answer it. He asks that why many fast radio burst signals are so mysterious. So if you'd like to comment.
So I have no idea. I don't think anyone has any idea to answer the second question, but it would be my guess that if the extraterrestrial life is present somewhere, then it is very unlikely that it is present in the current observational sphere of humans, because we have only observed extensively up to a few thousands of light years, and it is quite unlikely for extraterrestrial life to be present in that sphere. And I have not done much research on the FR bursts, but many scientists are currently investigating, and you and I would love to hear more about that.
Okay, thanks a lot. So I see that Oritra Kundu has raised a hand, so you can unmute yourself and ask your question if you have one.
Yeah, so my question is that you showed in the introductory slides that the spiral galaxies, the large scale effect is more compared to the elliptical galaxies. But you also mentioned that the spiral galaxies show more depolarization. So is this a discrepancy or am I missing some point?
So the large scale magnetic field strength in spiral galaxies is not actually more than the small scale magnetic field strength, because turbulence is present in both spirals and elliptical galaxies. So small scale magnetic fields are present in spiral galaxies as well. In fact, their magnitudes are approximately 1.5 times higher than the large scale magnetic field strengths. So that's why they depolarize more than the elliptical galaxies. The point I wanted to put through was that the large scale fields in elliptical galaxies are almost non-existent because of the lack of any large scale dynamics. So the small scale magnetic field strengths are much higher than the large scale magnetic field strengths in the case of elliptical galaxies.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I think that those are all excellent questions and that was an excellent talk. So thank you, Hila. So I think it is time that we go to the next talk of the session. So the next talk will be delivered by Neil Kohler from St. Xavier's College, Mumbai. So Neil, you can go ahead and start your talk.
Great, am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
Okay. So today I'm going to talk about this very interesting event which happened in this pulsar in April, and how we observed it with the UGMRT and what we have learned from it. So a quick outline of my talk. I'm going to give you a brief introduction of what pulsars are, what pulsar timing arrays are, and this one particular pulsar which we have studied. I'll go through the analysis and what we gleaned from it, and later we can discuss the results and the implications of those results. And I'll then basically give you a quick summary of what we talked about. So what are pulsars? You might know pulsars are rapidly rotating neutron stars with a very, very strong magnetic field, which emit a broadband radio emission from their poles. And as they rotate, if you cross their line of sight, you will see the radio emission as pulses. These pulses are like fingerprints of these pulsars, which are very unique to every single pulsar, and they have a very unique profile, and you can understand a lot about pulsar properties by studying these particular profiles. Millisecond pulsars are a subcategory of pulsars, a very special one, which have a rotational period of about 10 microseconds plus or minus. They're extremely stable rotators, and they have very less occurrence of glitches. Glitches are random jumps in the timing, in the timing skills of the pulsar. Because there aren't a lot of glitches, they are excellent timing sources. Because pulsars rotate very, very regularly, if you model other dynamics around observation, for example, the movement of the Earth around the sun, or the movement of the sun in the galaxy, or how the interstellar medium between the line of sight, between the observer and the object changes, if you model all of those really well, we are able to time pulsars really accurately and basically use them as clocks. After subtracting out all these things of these residuals in timing is rivaled by atomic clocks and nothing else. So why do we want to time pulsars in the first place? So pulsars are being timed to detect these gravitational waves have a wavelength of many light years, and to detect them, we use pulsars. So if a gravitational wave is interacting with a pulsar, the time of arrival of the pulse from the pulsar towards our telescope will change. This change in time of arrival, if modeled really well, we can figure out how and where the gravitational waves are essentially coming from, and that's the whole idea of a pulsar timing array. If you have multiple pulsars in the galactic plane, and if you're observing them very regularly, you should be able to localize where the source is coming from and other properties of the gravitational wave. So there is an incoherent and uncorrelated background of gravitational waves out in the universe, which is being generated by many mergers of galaxies and supermassive black holes, which is called the stochastic background. And these pulsar timing experiments are expected to detect this stochastic gravitational background in the near future. In say about a decade or so, when the SK comes up, we should also be able to resolve out individual binaries of these supermassive black holes. So that's why we need pulsars, and that's why we need to understand how these pulsars behave. And if the pulsar is showing a weird behavior, we should definitely be able to model it. And one such behavior was observed by us in April. So we are the Indian Pulsar Timing Array Consortium. We are a group of about 40 astronomers from India and Japan from various institutes. We have a lot of students and a lot of professional astronomers work together to study pulsars and their properties. And we take a lot of pride in training a bunch of undergraduate students to do active research, including observations, analysis, as well as all aspects of research. So that's us. So let's meet the star of the day, which is the pulsar J1713. It has a period of about 4.6 milliseconds. It's a binary. Its companion is a white dwarf. And it is one of the best pulsars which is timed out there with one of the lowest noise profiles out there. And in the past, it has shown two different timing events. That is, it has shown at two different instances in the past. In the past, it has shown a deviation from its usual timing residue. And this one is the third, the event which we observed. So as I have mentioned before, pulsar timing and detecting gravitational waves requires continuous observation of pulsars. So while our continuous observations were taking place back in April 2021, we observed that one such pulsar, the pulsar J1713, underwent a profile change. The profile changed from what you see down here to what you see on the top. It became slightly narrow, and there was a trailing edge which came up, which was not observed before. So to investigate what was going on, we had a continuum series of observations with the GMRT in two different subbands. In band 3, it was from 300 to 500 megahertz, and in band 5, it was from 1216 to 1460 megahertz. We use two bands because it gives us better understanding of what exactly the physics is going on. Band 3, the frequency band 3 is dispersed more by the ISM, and band 5 is not as much, so it gives us more information about whatever physics is going on really close to the pulsar. So this this particular study was conducted on 20 different epochs, that is instances of observation, 14 before the event and 16 after, and 6 after the event. And after reducing the data and analyzing it, reducing radio RFI interference, we were able to study what exactly was happening. So we analyzed it using several methods, and here's the first one. What you see here is an integrated flux profile over the phase of the pulsar. These are MJD just means days. These are just days counting up from this particular day to this particular day. And over here, you can see that there is a change in the flux. So every single block here, every single block of rows here is a single day. And you can see there's a clear change in both band 3, that is the 500 megahertz band, and the 1460 band in band 5. There's a clear change at this particular MJD. Accompanied by the profile change. So this kind of gives you a visual representation that the profile of the pulsar did change. To quantify it more, we did some more analysis. So what we did was the 14 epochs, which were for the 14 epochs from before the event, were averaged into a profile, a template profile which we subtracted from how the profile looked like before the event and how the profile looked like after the event. From before the event, if we subtract it out, we basically get RMS noise, and we did some statistical analysis by calculating the standard deviation and the medium of how different it is from the RMS noise. And for the observations before the event, we basically get no deviation. But for observations after the event, we definitely get a lot of deviation. In band 5, we get about 12 times the RMS deviation, and in band 3, we get about 8 times the RMS deviation. It's a clear indicator that there was a profile change. We also studied its timing residuals. As I mentioned before, timing residuals are changes in the time of arrival of the pulse. As you can see, at this particular MJD, at this particular day, there's a clear change in, there's a clear about 46 microsecond change in the time of arrival of the pulses. And we also see that the time of arrival is kind of recovering. There's kind of a recovery here. So to model this particular jump, we used a few models. Among some of the models which we used were a model in which changes in the DM were involved. So if there was some interstellar medium activity going on which changed the time of arrival, the model should be able to account for that. The other model which we used modeled for scattering, and the third model which we used had the chromatic index being a free parameter, and the best fit being ended up being the third model, where the chromatic index was clearly show a bigger jump, and the band 3 residuals show a smaller jump. This has a lot of physics implications. We'll discuss this in the next slide. So what exactly are we seeing here? Because band 3 variations are smaller than band 5 variations, it kind of tells us that this is not an ISM event. There isn't some interstellar cloud which is interfering with our line of sight, just causing the change in the pulse profile. This has to be something which is very, very close to the pulsar. Our conjecture is that there was a change in the magnetosphere, orientation of the magnetosphere of the pulsar, and it changed the structure of the radio beams, which we observed, which we quantified as the profile change. And this reorganization of the magnetosphere caused the profile change. The recovery which we see in the previous slide over here, can be quantified to about 156 days. And we think that the magnetosphere is going back to normal. So the event took place, there was a change in the magnetosphere, the beams reoriented, and now the beams are going back to their normal state over a period of, say, 156 days. So that is kind of what we observed. So in summary, we have observed a profile change in this particular pulsar. The profile change is fairly significant. It's the first profile change in which we see a proper recovery. We kind of figure out that this has to come from the source of the change of the profile change is very, very close to the pulsar. It doesn't show glitchy behavior, but it shows more of a mode change behavior, which is associated with change, which is associated with changes in the magnetosphere. And we are regularly observing the pulsar even today. We have regular observations which take place, and they're trying to model how the recovery goes ahead. It's important that we model these pulsars because these pulsars are a part of the pulsar timing array experiments, various pulsar timing array experiments. And if these pulsars if these mode changing pulsars aren't modeled for, they are going to introduce a lot of noise in the data set, which won't let us detect these nano-Earth gravitational waves, which we do expect to detect in the future. So this kind of implores us to model these pulsars better and these mode changes better as well. So basically, that's my talk. You can find our paper published in MNRS letters here. And if you have any questions, you can contact me or the lead author, who's Jacob Basinga. That's it for me. But there are other talks and presentations by other group members from NPTA. Raghav is going to talk in a few minutes about DM measurements with the GMRT. Nikita has a poster about a very interesting new timing technique which we are using with the GMRT, and Adarsh has a poster on Pinta, a tool which we use to process the data from the GMRT in relation to pulsars. So that's about it. I'll be happy to take any questions.
Okay, thanks a lot, Neil. So that was an excellent talk. So we have several questions in the chat box.
Yeah.
But firstly, I see that Orithra Kundu has raised his hand. So if you want to ask a question, you can unmute and ask.
Yeah, so my question is regarding a fifth point that you have mentioned that this has implications for PT experiments and detection of nano-Earth gravitational waves.
Yeah.
So where does this particular deviation or detection stands in the context of detecting gravitational waves?
So as I said before, that the way you detect gravitational waves is that you study the residuals from a set of pulsars. Usually you need at least 2 pulsars to make a gravitational wave detection. So if you are going to observe these residuals, say for example, these residuals over here, and these residuals, if you model the way a gravitational wave interacts with a pulsar, you can model how these residuals will basically look like. And if there are more changes in the pulsar, if the residuals are being changed by some internal mechanism of the pulsar, like the magnetosphere or like glitches, it will basically introduce noise. So I won't be able to tell you how quantifiably how much of this one particular pulsar is going to affect the PTA timing data sets. But as this is the third event from the same pulsar, and the data from this pulsar from many years is going to be used in the data set. So this pulsar kind of ends up being suspect. So if you don't model this well enough, it will eventually introduce noise when you try to detect gravitational waves. How much? I don't think so people have quantified yet. So not just us, but other people have not. But I think it's a very good question and something like, PTA people should think more about.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Saurav. So there are some questions in the chat box. So Saurav Natto asked, do we need to perform baseline correction of a SDSS spectra before the measurement?
Could you please repeat that? Sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Yes, so he asked that, do we need to perform the baseline correction of a SDSS spectra before the measurement?
So SDSS is an optical data set, right? They're observing in the radio, so we don't need to. It's a very different band, very different frequency. So no relation to SDSS or optical studies. But optical studies in some ways do inform PTA studies in the context that data from SDSS can be used to kind of quantify how many merging galaxies there are, which can be then correlated to the gravitational wave background. So we can compare the predictions from PTA gravitational wave background studies, which predict a certain number of galaxies which are merging out there. The background is supposed to predict that. And we can compare it to the optical studies, and we can see if there's a discrepancy, which can basically tell us that there are things in our understanding of optical studies and radio studies which might be different. So that's how you can maybe use SDSS data in comparison to PTA.
Okay, so the next question is from Sheikh Nasim Ali, who asked, can you briefly elaborate on the use of the RFI clean tool?
Okay, so I can maybe like for a bit I can do it, but there's a poster presented by Adarsh, who's one of my colleagues and friends. You can maybe go check that out. He'll elaborate that in detail. But the way it works, generally the way it works is because there are a lot of satellites which circle the Earth and a lot of radio interference from telecommunication towers. If the frequency ranges match up, and if those sources are close to the telescope or in our line of sight of observation, those basically come up in those artifacts basically come up in our observations. So we basically literally have to manually take up the graph. Sometimes before RFI clean was introduced, we had to basically manually see the graph, see where the interference is, and basically cut out that part of the graph to remove data. So RFI clean just automates all of it. I think Adarsh's poster, and he might be able to describe it much better. So I was not involved in developing this tool, but he studied much better. I'll point you there.
Okay, so the next and last question is from Aparajita Bhattacharya.
Yeah.
To ask that, why do millisecond pulsars have fewer glitches? I am not a millisecond pulsar expert, but recently I attended this talk by a person who was an expert in millisecond pulsars, and it has to do with the internal structure of the neutron star, where because neutron stars have multiple layers, the crust, the inner crust, and a superfluid layer inside. There is this phenomena of pinning and unpinning of superfluid layers on the inside, which causes these glitches. I don't know the exact physics behind why it exactly happens, but it's a very interesting area of study, because it's a very interdisciplinary area in which you have to understand how fluid dynamics works, you have to understand how quark gluon plasma works, and you have to understand the astrophysics of pulsar. So it's a very complex field and something which is being studied. I'm not an expert. I almost don't know anything about it. Okay, so thanks a lot, Neil. So these were the questions. So I think it is time to go to the next talk of this session. So the next talk of this session will be given by Hello, am I audible?
Yeah, you are.
Okay, thanks. So the next talk of this session will be given by Rajdeep Mukesh Agarwal from IIT Hyderabad. So yeah, Rajdeep, you can go ahead.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Just a minute. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rajdeep, a student of the Department of Physics at IIT Hyderabad. And my research project is regarding the search for Lorentz invariance violation using the stacked gamma ray burst spectral lag data. So I'd like to start off with a brief introduction of what gamma ray bursts are and how they are a motivation for this particular project. So as some of us might know, gamma ray bursts are extremely energetic explosions and some of the brightest known events to occur in the universe. And in recent times, they formed the basis for multiple studies to probe Lorentz invariance violation. So Lorentz invariance, in fact, does form the cornerstone of special relativity, implying the speed of light remains constant every time in all frames of reference. But at higher energies, up to the Planck's energy, it is detected that this symmetry is in fact prone to violation. And in fact, the gamma ray bursts are a very essential probe for the same, because the essential implication of LIV is that the photons will have their energies, their velocities dependent on energies in vacuum in case of Lorentz invariance violation. And since the gamma ray bursts have high energy as well as low energy photons arriving at the Earth whose spectral lag data, which we will analyze, so hence analyzing them can be an essential probe for LIV. So the spectral lag data is essentially the difference in the time lag for the arrival of the low energy and high energy photons from the gamma ray burst, with each spectral lag or each gamma ray burst having a fingerprint light curve of its own. So first I'll describe the datasets that were incorporated in the analysis and how each of them is unique and distinct. The first one was by Wei et al. In a 2017 paper, where this particular GRB was analyzed with the second subburst lasting 770 seconds, a slightly longer one. So 37 independent spectral lags could be obtained from them at